At 73 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing in my own kitchen, checkbook in hand, writing out a monthly rent payment for the house my late husband and I had bought 45 years ago. The house where I'd raised my children, hosted countless family dinners, and where I'd planned to spend my final years surrounded by the memories Walter and I had built together. What started as my son Brandon moving back home with his family during tough times became the most devastating betrayal of my life. But sometimes, when people push you too far, you discover just how strong an angry grandmother can be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Danica Rodriguez, and for most of my life, I believed family meant everything. Growing up in a cramped apartment in East Los Angeles, I watched my mother work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. When Walter and I scraped together enough money for a down payment on our little 3-bedroom house on Maple Street in Riverside back in 1978, it felt like winning the lottery. The mortgage payments were steep for a young couple, Walter working construction and me cleaning houses, but we made it work because we had a dream. This house would be our legacy, the place where our children would feel safe and loved, where grandchildren would run through the backyard chasing butterflies, and where family traditions would be born. Walter always said that home wasn't just about the walls and roof over your head. Home was about the love you put into every corner, every room, every memory you created. Together, we painted every wall, planted every flower in the garden, and celebrated every milestone within these walls. When Brandon was born, we converted the small den into a nursery, staying up nights assembling his crib and painting cartoon characters on the walls. When our daughter Sarah came along 3 years later, we added a swing set in the backyard and spent weekends teaching them to ride bikes on the quiet street. The house on Maple Street became the heart of our family. Every Christmas morning happened in our living room, with Walter dressed as Santa, and me making my famous tamales that took 2 days to prepare. Every birthday party, every graduation celebration, every important moment in our children's lives unfolded in this house. When Brandon brought his first girlfriend home for dinner, she sat at our dining room table, nervous and fidgeting, while Walter told embarrassing stories about Brandon's childhood. When Sarah graduated nursing school, we threw a party in our backyard with all the neighbors and relatives, everyone celebrating her achievement under the string lights Walter had hung between the oak trees. As the years passed, the house grew with our memories. We refinished the hardwood floors when the kids were teenagers, updated the kitchen when we could finally afford granite countertops, and added a master bathroom when Walter's back started giving him trouble. Every improvement, every change, every dollar we invested was done with love and the knowledge that this place belonged to us. Not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually, completely. This was our sanctuary, our achievement, our proof that 2 kids from struggling families could build something beautiful and lasting. Brandon was always my sensitive child. Where Sarah was independent and driven, marching off to nursing school with determination and purpose, Brandon seemed to struggle with direction. He bounced between jobs, moved in and out of relationships, and often came to Walter and me when things got difficult. We never minded helping our son. Parents are supposed to be there when their children need support, and we had worked hard enough to be in a position where we could offer that support when necessary. When Brandon married Jessica 5 years ago, I was hopeful that marriage would give him the stability he'd been searching for. Jessica seemed nice enough during their courtship, though she had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She made comments about our furniture being outdated, suggested we needed to modernize the house, and often hinted that Walter and I were too set in our old-fashioned ways. But she made Brandon happy, and that's what mattered to me. Love can smooth over personality differences, I thought. Marriage would help them both grow up and become the responsible adults they needed to be. Walter and I welcomed Jessica into our family with open hearts. We included her in our traditions, made space for her preferences during holiday celebrations, and tried to build the kind of relationship where she would feel comfortable and loved. When they announced Jessica was pregnant with their first child, Walter and I were overjoyed. We were going to be grandparents, and our house would once again ring with the laughter of children. The legacy would continue, the next generation would run through these same hallways and play in the same backyard where Brandon and Sarah had grown up. Tyler was born on a rainy Thursday in March, and holding my grandson for the first time in the hospital room, I felt a completeness I hadn't known I was missing. Walter's eyes filled with tears as he looked at this tiny person who carried our family forward into the future. We spent hours discussing all the things we would teach Tyler, all the adventures we would have together, all the ways we would spoil him the way grandparents are supposed to spoil their grandchildren. When they brought Tyler home from the hospital, our house transformed into something magical again, filled with baby sounds and the gentle chaos of new parents learning their way. 2 years later, Emma joined our family, a perfect little girl with dark curls and Walter's mischievous smile. Our house was alive again with the energy of young children, and Walter and I felt like we were reliving the best parts of raising our own kids. Tyler would follow Walter around the yard, helping with gardening and asking endless questions about how things worked. Emma loved to sit in my lap while I cooked, chattering away in her toddler language and trying to help with every recipe. These were the golden days, when being grandparents felt like the reward for all the hard work of raising children. But underneath the joy, I started noticing changes in the family dynamics that made me uncomfortable. Brandon and Jessica seemed to take our help for granted in ways that troubled me. When Tyler needed clothes, they assumed Walter and I would provide them. When Emma needed a crib upgrade, they expected us to purchase it. When their car broke down, they automatically asked to borrow money for repairs without discussing repayment plans. Walter and I had always been generous with our children, but the requests were becoming more frequent and more expensive, and the gratitude was becoming less evident. Jessica, in particular, seemed to view our generosity as obligation rather than gift. She would make comments about how we should be contributing more to the grandchildren's needs, how other grandparents she knew did more for their families, how we should feel lucky to have grandchildren to spoil. When I tried to gently suggest that they might want to budget more carefully or look for ways to become more self-sufficient, Jessica would become defensive and accuse me of not caring about my own grandchildren's welfare. The conversations were becoming tense and uncomfortable, but I convinced myself these were normal growing pains, as we all adjusted to being an extended family. Walter's health started declining when he turned 78. The man who had built our house with his own hands, who had worked construction for 40 years without missing a day, began struggling with tasks that had once been simple. His arthritis made it difficult to maintain the yard he'd always taken pride in. His breathing problems meant he tired easily during activities that used to energize him. Doctor visits became more frequent, and medical bills started accumulating despite our Medicare coverage. But Walter remained determined to maintain his independence and continue living in the house he'd worked so hard to provide for our family. When Walter passed away suddenly from a heart attack last year, my world collapsed in ways I couldn't have imagined. The man who had been my partner for 52 years, my best friend, my anchor, was gone. The house felt enormous and empty without his presence. Every room held memories that were now tinged with grief. His coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink where he'd left it that final morning. His reading glasses remained on the nightstand next to his side of the bed. His tools still hung organized in the garage, waiting for projects he would never complete. The grief was overwhelming, but what made it worse was feeling alone in the house that had always been filled with love and laughter. Brandon and Jessica had moved out to their own apartment when Tyler started school, wanting more space and independence. Sarah lived 3 hours away in San Francisco, building her career as a nurse practitioner and starting her own family. I understood that adult children needed to live their own lives, but the silence in the house was deafening. I would sit in Walter's chair in the evening, looking around at the empty rooms, wondering if I should consider selling the house and moving to something smaller and more manageable. But every time I considered leaving, I would remember Walter's words about this house being our legacy. This was where our children had grown up, where our grandchildren were learning about family traditions, where 50 years of memories lived in every corner. Selling felt like abandoning everything Walter and I had built together. This house was proof of our life's work, evidence that we had succeeded in creating something meaningful and lasting. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers living in our bedroom, cooking in our kitchen, sitting in our living room where we had shared so many precious moments. 3 months after Walter's funeral, Brandon came to me with what he called a proposition. He and Jessica were struggling financially, he explained. Their rent had increased significantly, and they were having trouble making ends meet on Brandon's inconsistent income from his landscaping business. Emma was starting preschool, which added another expense to their monthly budget. Tyler needed new clothes and school supplies. They were drowning in bills and needed help getting back on their feet. I listened to my son's explanation with a mother's heart, remembering all the times Walter and I had struggled when our children were young. I knew how difficult it could be to provide for a family when money was tight, how stressful it was to worry about making rent while trying to give your children everything they needed. When Brandon asked if he and his family could move back into the house temporarily, just until they could save enough money to get ahead, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Family helps family, especially during difficult times. Walter would have wanted me to open our home to our son and grandchildren when they needed support. The arrangement seemed perfect at first. I wouldn't be alone in the big house anymore. Tyler and Emma would be back where I could spoil them properly. And Brandon and Jessica would have the stability they needed to get their finances in order. We agreed they would stay for 6 months, maybe a year at the most, just long enough for them to save money and find a better living situation. I moved some of my furniture to make room for their belongings, converted Walter's office back into a bedroom for the children, and prepared to enjoy having a full house again. Initially, having everyone back home felt wonderful. The house came alive with children's voices and the pleasant chaos of family life. Tyler would run into my bedroom in the mornings, climbing into bed with me to tell me about his dreams and plans for the day. Emma would help me bake cookies in the afternoon, standing on a chair beside me and carefully measuring ingredients while chattering about her preschool friends. Brandon seemed more relaxed and focused when he wasn't worried about making rent every month, and even Jessica appeared grateful for the breathing room the arrangement provided. But as weeks turned into months, I began noticing changes that concerned me. Brandon and Jessica stopped talking about their temporary stay as temporary. They started making modifications to the house without asking my permission, rearranging furniture and redecorating rooms according to their preferences. Jessica complained that my kitchen wasn't organized efficiently and began moving my dishes and cookware to different cabinets. She criticized my housekeeping methods and suggested I was too old to maintain the house properly without help. More troubling was the way they began treating me like a guest in my own home. Jessica would make comments about how I needed to be more considerate of their privacy, how I shouldn't enter their bedroom or go through their belongings, how I needed to respect their parenting decisions when it came to Tyler and Emma. When I tried to maintain some of my own routines and traditions, like watching my favorite television shows in the evening or preparing meals the way I had always done them, Jessica would sigh dramatically and make remarks about how difficult it was to live with someone who was set in their ways. The financial arrangement also started changing in ways that made me uncomfortable. Initially, Brandon and Jessica had offered to help with grocery bills and utilities to offset the additional costs of having 4 extra people in the house, but their contributions became irregular and eventually stopped altogether. When I mentioned that the electricity bill had increased significantly and asked if they could help, Jessica became defensive and pointed out that they were saving me money by doing household chores and maintaining the yard. She suggested that having them in the house was actually benefiting me more than it was benefiting them, since I would otherwise be lonely and unable to handle the maintenance myself. The situation escalated when Jessica announced that they had decided to stay permanently. She explained that moving again would be disruptive for the children, that Tyler was settled in his school and Emma loved her preschool, that it made more sense for everyone to remain together as an extended family. She presented this decision as if it were already made, as if my agreement was assumed rather than requested. When I expressed concern about the long-term arrangement and suggested we should discuss boundaries and expectations, Jessica became angry and accused me of not wanting my own grandchildren to feel welcome in their family home. That phrase, family home, was when I realized how completely the situation had shifted. Jessica was no longer talking about my house where they were temporarily staying. She was talking about a family home where she and Brandon had equal claim to space and decision-making. The house that Walter and I had bought and paid for, the house where we had raised our children and built our memories, was being redefined as communal family property where my wishes were just one voice among many, and not necessarily the most important voice. The breaking point came 6 months after they had moved in, when Jessica informed me that they had decided I should start contributing to household expenses in a more structured way. She had calculated what she called my fair share of mortgage, utilities, groceries, and maintenance costs, and she expected me to pay monthly rent to cover these expenses. The amount she requested was nearly $800 per month, money that would come from the Social Security and pension income that was supposed to support me through my retirement years. When I pointed out that I owned the house and shouldn't have to pay rent to live in my own home, Jessica's response revealed the depth of her entitlement and manipulation. She explained that since I was only one person and they were a family of 4, it was actually unfair for me to expect them to cover a larger share of household costs. She suggested that I was being selfish and unreasonable to expect free housing when everyone else was contributing to the family's welfare. She pointed out that elderly people often had to make financial sacrifices to live with family members, and that I should be grateful to have the option rather than being forced into a nursing home or assisted living facility. The conversation was devastating, not just because of Jessica's demands, but because of Brandon's silence. My son, the child I had raised and supported and loved unconditionally, sat quietly while his wife explained why I should pay rent to live in the house his father and I had spent 50 years paying off. When I looked at Brandon for support, for some indication that he understood how wrong this situation had become, he avoided my eyes and mumbled something about everyone needing to contribute fairly to make the arrangement work. That night, alone in my bedroom while the rest of the family watched television in what used to be my living room, I sat on the edge of the bed Walter and I had shared and cried harder than I had since his funeral. I felt betrayed not just by Jessica's manipulation, but by Brandon's willingness to go along with it. This was my son, the child who used to crawl into this same bed when he had nightmares, who I had supported through every difficulty and challenge in his life. Now he was standing by silently while his wife demanded rent payments from his grieving mother. But even as I grieved the betrayal, I felt something else stirring inside me. Anger. Not the explosive kind of anger that burns out quickly, but the steady, determined anger that comes from being pushed beyond your limits by people who have underestimated you. Walter used to say that I had a core of steel beneath my gentle exterior, and that anyone who mistook kindness for weakness would eventually discover their error. Jessica and Brandon were about to learn that 73-year-old widows who have survived 50 years of marriage, raised children, and built something meaningful from nothing are not as helpless as they appear. The first rent payment felt like swallowing poison. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Walter and I had paid our bills together for decades, writing out a check to my own son for the privilege of living in the house I owned. $800 from my fixed income, money that Walter and I had carefully saved and budgeted for my golden years, now going to Brandon and Jessica as if I were some tenant who had overstayed her welcome. My hands shook as I signed my name, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying again. Jessica accepted the check with a satisfied smile that made my stomach turn. She actually thanked me for being reasonable and cooperative, as if I had volunteered for this arrangement rather than been cornered into it. She mentioned that she would be setting up a spreadsheet to track household expenses more efficiently, ensuring that everyone's contributions were fair and transparent. The way she spoke, you would have thought she was doing me a favor by organizing my financial exploitation with such careful attention to detail. That first month of paying rent in my own home opened my eyes to how thoroughly Brandon and Jessica had rewritten the rules of our living arrangement. It wasn't just the money. Though losing $800 from my monthly budget meant cutting back on things that had once brought me comfort and independence. I had to cancel my weekly dinners with my friend Carol, stop my monthly visits to the hair salon, and eliminate the small luxuries that made living on a fixed income bearable. But worse than the financial strain was the psychological impact of being treated like a burden in the place where I had once been the matriarch. Jessica began implementing what she called house rules, with the authority of someone who had forgotten she was living in someone else's home. She created a schedule for kitchen use, assigning me specific times when I could cook my meals without interfering with her family's routines. She established quiet hours when I was expected to keep the television volume low and avoid activities that might disturb Tyler and Emma's homework time or bedtime routines. She designated certain areas of the house as family spaces where I needed permission before entering, including the living room during evening hours and the backyard when the children were playing. The most painful rule was the one about meal times. Jessica announced that they would be eating dinner as a nuclear family unit, just Brandon, herself, and the children, without including me in their daily meals. She explained that this arrangement would be better for everyone, giving them privacy to discuss family matters and allowing me to maintain my independence by preparing my own food. What she really meant was that I was no longer welcome at my own dining room table, the place where Walter and I had shared thousands of meals, and where I had hoped to continue family traditions with my grandchildren. I found myself eating alone in the kitchen most evenings, listening to the sounds of my family enjoying dinner together in the next room. Tyler and Emma's laughter would drift through the doorway, mixing with Brandon and Jessica's conversation about their day, their plans, their lives that apparently no longer included their grandmother and mother in any meaningful way. Sometimes Tyler would run into the kitchen after dinner, asking if I had any cookies or wanting to tell me about something that happened at school, but Jessica would quickly call him back, reminding him that Grandma needed her own time and space. The isolation was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had welcomed them into my home to avoid loneliness, but somehow I felt more alone than I had when the house was empty. At least when I lived by myself, the solitude was honest. I could sit in any room, watch any television program, cook any meal, and feel like I belonged in my own space. Now I felt like an intruder, constantly walking on eggshells and second-guessing my right to exist comfortably in the house Walter and I had built together. My relationship with Tyler and Emma began to suffer under Jessica's new regime. She discouraged them from spending too much time with me, explaining that they needed to focus on their schoolwork and family time rather than bothering their grandmother with constant demands for attention. When I offered to help Tyler with his homework or asked Emma about her day at preschool, Jessica would intervene with suggestions that I was overwhelming the children with too much attention, or interfering with their parents' authority. The children, confused by these mixed messages, started becoming more distant and hesitant around me. Tyler stopped running to my room in the mornings, and Emma became shy about asking for help with her activities. I could see them looking between their mother and me during conversations, trying to navigate the tension they didn't understand but clearly felt. It broke my heart to watch my grandchildren being taught to see me as an outsider rather than a beloved family member who wanted nothing more than to be part of their lives. Brandon's role in this transformation was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire situation. My son, who had once been my confidant and ally, became increasingly distant and uncomfortable whenever I tried to discuss the changes happening in our household. When I attempted to talk to him privately about Jessica's rules and demands, he would deflect the conversation or suggest that everyone needed time to adjust to the new living arrangements. He acted as if these weren't permanent changes to our relationship, but temporary growing pains that would resolve themselves if everyone just tried to be patient and understanding. But I could see in Brandon's eyes that he knew exactly what was happening. He knew his wife was systematically isolating me and taking control of my home. He knew that charging me rent was wrong and manipulative. He knew that excluding me from family meals and activities was cruel and unnecessary. But he also knew that challenging Jessica would create conflict in his marriage, and he had chosen to preserve his relationship with his wife at the expense of his relationship with his mother. The cowardice was almost worse than Jessica's outright hostility. 3 months into this new arrangement, Jessica announced another change that would further formalize my status as a tenant rather than the homeowner. She had decided that we needed to establish more professional boundaries around the financial aspects of our living situation, including a written rental agreement that would clarify everyone's rights and responsibilities. She presented me with a document she had drafted, outlining my obligations as a renter and their obligations as the primary household managers. The rental agreement was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as reasonable accommodation. It specified that I would pay $800 monthly rent, plus my proportional share of utilities, groceries, and maintenance costs. It granted me exclusive use of the master bedroom and bathroom, but designated all other areas of the house as common spaces subject to household rules and schedules. It established Jessica and Brandon as the primary decision-makers for all household matters, including maintenance, repairs, landscaping, and any modifications to the property. Most significantly, the agreement included a clause about lease termination that gave them the right to ask me to leave with 30 days' notice if they determined that the living arrangement was no longer working for their family's needs. In other words, I could be evicted from my own house if Jessica decided I was causing problems or interfering with their lifestyle. The document transformed me from homeowner to tenant with no security, no rights, and no recourse if they decided they wanted me gone. When I refused to sign the rental agreement, Jessica's mask of reasonableness finally slipped completely. She accused me of being difficult and unreasonable, of trying to control their lives and manipulate their family. She said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that most elderly people would be thrilled to have such a supportive family willing to help them maintain their independence. She suggested that my refusal to cooperate was evidence that I was becoming confused and unable to make rational decisions about my own welfare. The accusation that I was mentally incompetent was particularly cruel and strategic. Jessica knew that questioning my mental capacity would undermine any future attempts I might make to challenge their control or seek outside help. If she could establish a narrative that I was becoming forgetful, confused, or irrational, then my objections to their treatment could be dismissed as symptoms of age-related decline rather than legitimate grievances from someone being taken advantage of. Brandon's response to this confrontation was to retreat even further from any meaningful involvement in the situation. He mumbled something about everyone needing to compromise and suggested that maybe we should table the rental agreement discussion until emotions cooled down. But his willingness to even consider formalizing my rental status in my own home showed how completely he had abdicated his responsibility as my son and defender. He was willing to let his wife turn his mother into a paying tenant rather than stand up for what was right. The stress of living under these conditions began affecting my health in ways that frightened me. I started having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night listening to my family's conversations and feeling like a stranger in my own home. My appetite decreased, and I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. My blood pressure, which had been well controlled since Walter's death, began climbing again despite my medication. I found myself crying unexpectedly throughout the day, overwhelmed by grief not just for Walter's death but for the loss of the family relationships I had treasured. Dr. Martinez, my longtime physician, noticed the changes during my regular checkup and asked pointed questions about my living situation and stress levels. When I tried to explain what was happening at home, the words sounded so unbelievable that I wondered if Jessica might be right about my mental state. How could I tell my doctor that my son was allowing his wife to charge me rent to live in my own house? How could I explain that I was being excluded from family activities and treated like an unwelcome boarder in the home Walter and I had spent our lives building? But Dr. Martinez had known me for 15 years, and he recognized the signs of someone being emotionally and financially abused. He gently explained that elder abuse often came from family members who gradually increased their control and exploitation over time. He offered to connect me with social services and legal resources that could help me understand my rights and options. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was taking my situation seriously and recognizing that what was happening to me was wrong. My neighbor Carol also began noticing changes in my behavior and appearance. Carol and I had been friends for over 20 years, sharing coffee on our front porches and looking out for each other through various life challenges. She had been a tremendous source of comfort after Walter's death, checking on me regularly and including me in neighborhood activities. But since Brandon and Jessica had moved in, I had gradually withdrawn from these friendships, partly because of my restricted schedule, and partly because I was ashamed to admit how my own family was treating me. Carol confronted me directly one afternoon when she found me crying in my garden. I had been trying to maintain Walter's flower beds, one of the few activities that still brought me peace, but Jessica had complained that my gardening schedule interfered with the children's outdoor playtime. Carol sat beside me on the garden bench Walter had built and listened while I finally told someone the truth about what my life had become since my family moved back home. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. Carol had raised 4 children of her own and understood family dynamics well enough to recognize manipulation and abuse when she saw it. She pointed out that no loving son would allow his wife to charge his grieving mother rent to live in her own home. She explained that excluding me from family meals and activities wasn't about giving me independence. It was about isolating me and making me feel unwelcome so I would be easier to control. She helped me understand that Jessica's criticism of my mental state was a classic tactic used by abusers to discredit their victims. Carol's validation was like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating. For months, I had been questioning my own perceptions and wondering if I was being unreasonable or difficult. Jessica's constant suggestions that I was confused or demanding had made me doubt my right to object to treatment that felt wrong. But Carol helped me see the situation clearly again, confirming that my instincts were correct and my treatment was unacceptable. She also provided practical support that I desperately needed. Carol researched legal aid services for seniors and found an attorney who specialized in elder rights and property law. She helped me gather documentation of my home ownership, including the deed, mortgage records, and tax payments that proved my legal standing. She offered to serve as a witness to the changes in my living situation and the impact they were having on my health and well-being. Most importantly, Carol reminded me of who I had been before grief and manipulation had worn down my confidence. She talked about the strong woman who had raised 2 children while working multiple jobs, who had supported Walter through his health challenges, who had managed household finances and made important decisions for decades. She helped me remember that being kind and accommodating didn't mean I had to accept abuse, and that protecting myself wasn't selfish or unreasonable. The conversation with Carol marked the beginning of my awakening to the reality of my situation and the possibility that I didn't have to continue living this way. For months, I had felt trapped and helpless, believing that challenging Brandon and Jessica would mean losing access to my grandchildren and being completely alone. But Carol helped me understand that I was already losing my relationship with Tyler and Emma under the current circumstances, and that being alone with dignity was better than being surrounded by family who treated me with contempt. She also pointed out something that had been nagging at me, but that I hadn't fully articulated. Brandon and Jessica's financial situation didn't seem to be improving despite their supposed efforts to save money and get back on their feet. Brandon's landscaping business remained inconsistent, and Jessica showed no signs of looking for employment that would help support their family. They were treating my house like a permanent solution to their financial problems rather than a temporary stepping stone to independence. They had no intention of ever leaving or becoming self-sufficient because they had found a comfortable arrangement that met all their needs at my expense. The realization that this situation would never improve on its own was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant acknowledging that my son was willing to exploit me indefinitely rather than take responsibility for his own family's welfare. But liberating because it meant I could stop hoping for change and start planning for action. If Brandon and Jessica wanted to treat me like a tenant in my own home, then perhaps it was time to consider whether I wanted them as tenants at all. That night, I sat in Walter's chair in my bedroom and thought about what he would say if he could see what our family had become. Walter had loved our children deeply, but he had also believed in personal responsibility and treating people with respect. He would have been heartbroken to see Brandon allowing Jessica to manipulate and exploit me, but he also would have expected me to stand up for myself and protect what we had built together. I could almost hear Walter's voice reminding me that our house was more than just a building. It was a symbol of everything we had worked for and accomplished together. Letting Brandon and Jessica turn it into their personal profit center while treating me like an unwelcome burden wasn't just wrong. It was a betrayal of everything Walter and I had sacrificed to build. If our son couldn't appreciate the gift of growing up in a loving home and having parents who supported him through every challenge, then maybe he needed to learn what it felt like to lose that support. For the first time since this nightmare began, I started thinking about my options with clarity and determination, rather than fear and desperation. I owned this house free and clear. I had legal rights that couldn't be taken away by rental agreements or household rules. I had friends and resources and support systems that existed outside of my immediate family. Most importantly, I had a backbone that had supported me through 50 years of marriage, 2 children, and countless challenges that had required strength and courage. Jessica had made a critical error in her calculation of our family dynamics. She had assumed that my love for my grandchildren and my grief over Walter's death had made me completely vulnerable to manipulation. She had counted on my desire to avoid conflict and maintain family harmony to keep me compliant with her increasingly outrageous demands. But she had forgotten that grandmothers who have survived everything life can throw at them aren't nearly as helpless as they appear. She was about to discover that pushing someone too far can awaken a strength they didn't know they still possessed. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. I had spent months being reactive, responding to Jessica's demands and trying to accommodate her rules. But now I was ready to become proactive, to take control of my own life and home, in ways that would remind everyone exactly who owned this house and who had the power to decide who lived in it. The sweet, accommodating grandmother was about to disappear, replaced by a woman who had rediscovered her own strength and determination. Brandon and Jessica had no idea what was coming. They had gotten so comfortable with their arrangement, so confident in their control over the situation, that they couldn't imagine their victim fighting back. But Walter used to say that the most dangerous opponent was someone who had nothing left to lose, and I was rapidly approaching that point. If they wanted to treat me like an enemy in my own home, then perhaps it was time to show them what having a real enemy looked like. The explosion came on a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 8 months after Brandon and Jessica had moved into what they now openly called their home. I was preparing a simple dinner for myself in the kitchen when Tyler ran in, his face streaked with tears and his small shoulders shaking with sobs. Behind him came Jessica, her face twisted with fury and her voice sharp with the kind of anger that makes children cower in fear. Tyler had apparently broken one of Jessica's decorative vases while playing in the living room, and her reaction was so disproportionate and cruel that something inside me snapped completely. She was screaming at this 6-year-old child, calling him clumsy and careless, threatening to take away his toys and privileges for a month because he had accidentally knocked over a $20 vase while running through his own home. The sight of my grandson sobbing in terror while his mother berated him for a simple childhood accident awakened a protective fury in me that overrode every other consideration. I stepped between Jessica and Tyler, gathering my grandson into my arms and telling her firmly that she needed to stop yelling at him immediately. A broken vase was replaceable, but the emotional damage she was inflicting on her son with her explosive anger was not. Tyler wrapped his arms around my neck and buried his face against my shoulder, still crying but finding comfort in my embrace. For a moment, it felt like I was his grandmother again instead of the unwelcome stranger I had become in my own home. Jessica's reaction to my intervention was swift and vicious. She demanded that I mind my own business and stay out of her parenting decisions. She accused me of undermining her authority and spoiling Tyler by protecting him from consequences. She told me that my interference was exactly the kind of boundary violation that made living with me so difficult and stressful for her family. Her voice rose to a pitch that brought Brandon running from the garage, where he had been hiding from the conflict as usual. But I had reached my breaking point, and Jessica's attack on my relationship with my grandson dissolved whatever restraint I had been maintaining for the sake of family peace. I told her that this was my house, Tyler was my grandson, and I would not stand by and watch her terrorize a child over an accident that could happen to anyone. I pointed out that she was the one who had brought her family into my home when they couldn't afford their own place, and that treating me like an unwelcome intruder while living rent-free in my house was beyond ungrateful. The mistake in my words became apparent immediately. Jessica's eyes lit up with triumph as she seized on my accusation that they were living rent-free. She reminded me loudly that I was the one paying rent now, that I was the tenant, and they were the household managers who had graciously allowed me to remain in a house that had become too much for me to handle alone. She suggested that my memory problems were getting worse if I couldn't remember our financial arrangement, and that my outburst was further evidence that I was becoming confused and unable to manage my own affairs. Brandon's entry into the conflict was the final betrayal that shattered whatever hope I had maintained for salvaging our relationship. Instead of defending his mother or supporting my right to comfort my terrified grandson, he sided completely with Jessica. He told me that I was overreacting and making the situation worse by getting involved. He said that Jessica had every right to discipline her own children without interference from anyone else, including me. He suggested that my emotional outburst was concerning, and that maybe we needed to discuss whether the current living arrangement was still working for everyone. The implicit threat in Brandon's words was clear. If I continued to challenge Jessica's authority or interfere with her rules, they would find a way to remove me from my own home. The son I had raised and supported through every difficulty in his life was now prepared to abandon me if I didn't submit completely to his wife's control. The transformation of our family dynamic was complete. I was no longer Brandon's mother or Tyler and Emma's grandmother. I was an inconvenient obstacle to their comfortable lifestyle, someone to be managed and controlled rather than loved and respected. That night, after Tyler had been sent to bed without dinner as punishment for the broken vase and Emma had been warned about making too much noise, I lay in my bedroom staring at the ceiling and facing the reality of my situation with absolute clarity. There was no scenario in which this arrangement would improve or become tolerable. Jessica would continue pushing boundaries and increasing her control until I was completely powerless in my own home. Brandon would continue enabling her behavior and prioritizing his marriage over his relationship with me. The grandchildren I loved would be used as weapons against me, their affection weaponized to ensure my compliance with whatever demands their parents made. The next morning brought a new level of humiliation that confirmed everything I had realized during my sleepless night. Jessica announced that she had been researching assisted living facilities in the area and wanted to schedule some visits for me to explore my options. She explained that the stress of maintaining a household was clearly becoming too much for me to handle, and that my emotional instability was affecting the children's sense of security in their own home. She had printed out brochures for several facilities that specialized in caring for elderly people who were struggling with memory issues and behavioral problems. The suggestion that I needed to be placed in assisted living was both insulting and terrifying. Jessica was essentially telling me that I was too mentally incompetent to live independently, despite the fact that I had been managing my own household successfully for decades before they moved in. She was using my emotional response to Tyler's mistreatment as evidence that I was unstable and potentially dangerous to the children. Most frightening of all, she was presenting this as a caring solution to help me rather than an attempt to remove me from my own property. Brandon's silence during this conversation was deafening. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had served him thousands of meals throughout his childhood, and said nothing while his wife suggested that his mother needed to be institutionalized. When I looked at him directly and asked if he agreed with Jessica's assessment, he mumbled something about wanting what was best for everyone and needing to consider all options. His cowardice was so complete that he couldn't even voice support for keeping his own mother in her own home. The assisted living discussion was clearly a trial balloon, Jessica's way of testing whether I would resist the ultimate escalation of her control. If I accepted her assessment that I was too incompetent to live independently, then she could proceed with plans to have me removed from the house entirely. If I fought back, she would use my resistance as further evidence of my mental instability and inability to make rational decisions about my own welfare. Either way, she was positioning herself to win the final battle for complete control of my home and my life. But Jessica had made a critical miscalculation in her strategy. She had assumed that months of psychological manipulation and isolation had broken my spirit completely, that I would accept her characterization of me as a confused elderly woman who needed professional care. She had forgotten that the woman she was trying to intimidate had survived the Great Depression as a child, had raised 2 children while working multiple jobs, had supported a husband through serious illness, and had built a life from nothing through sheer determination and hard work. Her attempts to make me doubt my own competence had actually clarified my thinking and strengthened my resolve. That afternoon, while Jessica took the children to their various activities, and Brandon worked in the yard, I made a phone call that would change everything. I contacted Robert Martinez, the attorney Carol had recommended, and scheduled an emergency appointment to discuss my legal options. For months, I had been reacting to Jessica's manipulation and trying to find ways to accommodate her demands. But now I was ready to take control of the situation and remind everyone exactly who owned this house and who had the legal authority to decide who lived in it. Robert Martinez's office was located in a modest building downtown, and his waiting room was filled with elderly clients who looked as overwhelmed and confused as I felt. When he called me into his office, I was struck by his kind eyes and patient demeanor. He had clearly dealt with many families in crisis, and he understood the complex emotions involved when adult children turned against their parents. He listened to my story without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that helped me organize my thoughts and present the situation clearly. His legal assessment was both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because he confirmed that I had absolute legal rights as the property owner that couldn't be taken away by rental agreements or psychological manipulation. Jessica's house rules and financial demands had no legal standing, and any attempt to force me into assisted living against my will would require a court order based on medical evidence of incompetence that didn't exist. I was still the sole owner of my home with complete authority to decide who lived there and under what conditions. But his assessment was also alarming because he explained how difficult it could be to remove family members who had established residency, even when they had no legal right to be there. California tenant laws were designed to protect renters from arbitrary eviction, and those protections extended to family members who had been living in a property for an extended period. Even though Brandon and Jessica had never paid rent and had no written lease or an agreement, their 8-month residency gave them certain legal rights that would complicate any attempt to force them to leave. More troubling was his explanation of how elder abuse cases were often complicated by family dynamics and the victim's reluctance to take strong action against their own children. Many elderly parents endured financial and emotional abuse rather than face the social stigma of having their own family members arrested or evicted. Courts were reluctant to intervene in family disputes unless there was clear evidence of criminal behavior or immediate physical danger. The legal system was simply not equipped to handle the subtle psychological manipulation and financial exploitation that characterized most elder abuse cases. But Robert also explained that I had options that could be effective if I was willing to use them decisively. As the property owner, I could serve formal eviction notices that would force Brandon and Jessica to leave within 30 days. I could change the locks and refuse them access to the house, though this approach carried risks if they claimed abandonment of their belongings or argued that they had been illegally locked out of their legal residence. Most dramatically, I could sell the house entirely, forcing everyone to find new living arrangements and eliminating the source of conflict completely. The suggestion that I sell my home was initially devastating. This house contained 50 years of memories and represented everything Walter and I had worked to achieve. The idea of letting strangers live in our bedroom, cook in our kitchen, and raise their children in the backyard where Tyler and Emma played felt like betraying Walter's memory and abandoning our family legacy. But as Robert explained the practical advantages of selling, I began to see it as a strategy rather than a surrender. Selling the house would give me complete control over the timeline and outcome of the situation. Brandon and Jessica couldn't prevent me from selling my own property, and they couldn't refuse to leave once the sale was finalized. The proceeds from the sale would provide me with financial security and freedom to choose my own living arrangements without depending on anyone else. Most importantly, selling to the right buyer could serve as a form of justice, a way to ensure that Brandon and Jessica's comfortable lifestyle would be disrupted in proportion to the disruption they had caused in my life. Robert mentioned almost casually that he had other clients who might be interested in purchasing properties in my neighborhood. One client in particular, Marcus Thompson, had been looking for houses in my area for several months. Marcus was a successful businessman who specialized in property renovation and rental management. He was also someone who had a well-documented history of conflict with Brandon's landscaping business over a commercial project that had gone badly wrong several years earlier. The mention of Marcus Thompson's name triggered a memory that made my pulse quicken with possibility. 3 years ago, Brandon had been hired to landscape the grounds around a new office building that Marcus Thompson was developing. The project had started well, but Brandon's inconsistent work habits and poor time management had caused significant delays and cost overruns. When Marcus demanded completion of the work according to the original timeline, Brandon had responded with excuses and blame shifting that escalated into a heated public confrontation. Marcus had eventually hired another company to finish the landscaping, and Brandon had sued him for the remaining payment, while Marcus had countersued for damages and delays. The legal battle had dragged on for months, with both men spending more on attorney fees than the original contract was worth. Brandon had eventually dropped his lawsuit when it became clear that his case was weak, but Marcus had pursued his countersuit to completion and won a judgment for several $1,000s that Brandon had never been able to pay. The conflict had damaged Brandon's reputation in the local business community and contributed to the financial problems that had eventually forced him to move back into my house. Marcus Thompson represented everything that Brandon feared and resented. He was successful where Brandon was struggling, disciplined where Brandon was unreliable, and legally sophisticated where Brandon was naive. Most importantly, Marcus had proved that Brandon's victim mentality and blame shifting couldn't protect him from the consequences of his own poor choices. Selling my house to Marcus would be more than just a real estate transaction. It would be a statement that actions have consequences, and that exploiting people eventually leads to justice. The idea of selling to Marcus Thompson felt like divine intervention, a perfect solution that would solve my immediate problem while delivering a form of poetic justice that Walter would have appreciated. I could escape the toxic situation Brandon and Jessica had created, while ensuring that their comfortable exploitation of my generosity would end in the most ironic way possible. They would be forced to find their own housing and support their own family, just as they should have been doing all along. That evening, I sat in Walter's chair and thought about the conversation I would need to have with Brandon and Jessica. For 8 months, I had been accommodating their demands and trying to preserve family relationships that they had already destroyed through their selfishness and manipulation. But now I was ready to stop being a victim and start being a homeowner who demanded respect and appreciation from anyone living under her roof. The next morning, I would begin the process that would change everything. I would contact Marcus Thompson's real estate agent and arrange a private showing of my house. I would serve formal notice to Brandon and Jessica that their living arrangement was ending, whether they found their own place or not. Most importantly, I would reclaim my dignity and self-respect by refusing to accept treatment that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. The sweet, accommodating grandmother who had written rent checks for her own house was gone forever. In her place was a woman who had rediscovered her strength and determination, someone who understood that love without respect was worthless, and that family members who exploited your generosity deserved the same consideration they had shown you. Brandon and Jessica were about to learn that underestimating elderly women was a mistake that could have devastating consequences. Marcus Thompson arrived at my front door on a crisp Thursday morning in November, and the moment I opened it, I knew that fate was providing me with exactly the ally I needed. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the house that would soon become his property. His handshake was firm and confident, and when he smiled, I could see the determination that had made him successful in business and formidable as Brandon's adversary. I had reached out to Marcus through his real estate agent 3 days earlier, explaining that I was considering selling my home and had heard he might be interested in properties in my neighborhood. What I hadn't mentioned was my connection to Brandon or the personal satisfaction I hoped to achieve through this transaction. Marcus arrived expecting a routine property viewing, but I could tell he sensed there was more to the story when I mentioned that my son's family was currently living with me and would need to relocate once the sale was completed. During our initial walkthrough of the house, Marcus proved to be everything I had hoped for and more. He had done his research on the neighborhood property values and market trends, and he was prepared to make a cash offer that would eliminate the usual complications of mortgage approvals and lengthy closing processes. His questions about the house were intelligent and thorough, covering everything from the electrical system to the landscaping maintenance needs. But it was his casual mention of Brandon's business that confirmed he remembered their previous conflict and understood the implications of purchasing this particular property. Marcus asked if the landscaping had been professionally maintained, and when I mentioned that my son Brandon had been handling the yard work since moving in, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He made a polite comment about hoping Brandon's work had improved since their last professional interaction, but his tone suggested that he doubted any significant improvement had occurred. The subtle dig at Brandon's competence made it clear that Marcus retained strong negative feelings about their previous business relationship and the legal battle that had followed. What impressed me most about Marcus was his directness and honesty about his intentions for the property. He explained that he specialized in purchasing homes with good bones and solid foundations, then updating them to modern standards before either reselling them to families or converting them into high-end rental properties. He wasn't interested in preserving the house as a family home or maintaining its current character. His vision involved significant renovations, possible additions, and a complete transformation that would eliminate any traces of the life Walter and I had built there. Initially, this vision might have troubled me, but I found it oddly liberating. If the house was going to be stripped of its memories and transformed into something completely different, then I wouldn't have to worry about strangers living among my family's ghosts. Marcus would erase the past and create something new, which seemed appropriate given how thoroughly Brandon and Jessica had already corrupted the home's meaning for me. Sometimes destroying something completely was the only way to prevent its continued desecration. Marcus made his initial offer during that first visit, and it exceeded my expectations by almost $15,000. He explained that he preferred to work quickly when he found properties that met his criteria, and he was prepared to close within 30 days if I was motivated to sell promptly. The generous offer and expedited timeline were exactly what I needed to implement my plan before Brandon and Jessica could mount any legal challenges or emotional manipulation to prevent the sale. But the most satisfying moment of our initial meeting came when Marcus asked directly about the timeline for the current residents to vacate the property. I explained that they would need to find alternative housing arrangements, and Marcus nodded thoughtfully before making a comment that revealed he understood more about the situation than he had initially let on. He mentioned that in his experience, family members who had become accustomed to free housing often had difficulty adjusting to the reality of supporting themselves, especially when their previous living arrangements had enabled poor financial habits. The observation was delivered diplomatically, but it demonstrated that Marcus recognized the dynamics at play in my household. He understood that Brandon and Jessica had been taking advantage of my generosity, and he suspected that forcing them to become self-sufficient would be challenging for people who had grown comfortable avoiding personal responsibility. His insight into their character flaws gave me confidence that he would be an unsympathetic landlord if they ever tried to manipulate him the way they had manipulated me. Over the following week, Marcus and I worked through the details of the sale with an efficiency that surprised even his experienced real estate agent. The property inspection revealed no significant problems that would delay the transaction, and Marcus waived several standard contingencies to expedite the closing process. His mortgage pre-approval was solid, and his earnest money deposit demonstrated serious commitment to completing the purchase quickly. During this period, I continued living in the house with Brandon and Jessica, while secretly preparing for the bombshell I would soon drop on their comfortable lifestyle. The irony of maintaining normal family routines while planning their eviction was not lost on me. Jessica continued implementing her household rules and collecting my monthly rent payments, completely unaware that her authority was about to be permanently eliminated. Brandon continued avoiding any meaningful conversation about our family's future, apparently convinced that our current arrangement would continue indefinitely. The children, Tyler and Emma, remained caught in the middle of adult conflicts they couldn't understand, but I noticed small changes in their behavior that suggested they were feeling the tension even if they couldn't articulate it. Tyler had become more clingy and anxious, often asking when things would go back to normal and whether everyone would always live together in the same house. Emma had started having nightmares and seeking comfort from me during the night, despite Jessica's rules about maintaining appropriate boundaries between generations. Their innocent questions about our family's future broke my heart, because I knew that my decision to sell the house would be devastating for them in the short term. They would lose the stability of living in their grandparents' home, the security of extended family relationships, and the comfort of familiar surroundings. But I also believed that removing them from the toxic environment Jessica had created would ultimately benefit their emotional development and relationship with me. Carol proved to be an invaluable ally during this crucial period, providing both emotional support and practical assistance that made my secret preparations possible. She helped me research moving companies and storage facilities for my personal belongings, and she offered to let me stay in her guest room during the transition period between selling the house and finding my own new living arrangements. More importantly, she served as a witness to the ongoing dysfunction in my household and would be able to testify about Jessica's treatment of me if any legal challenges arose. Carol also helped me understand that my decision to sell was about more than just solving my immediate housing crisis. She pointed out that Brandon and Jessica's behavior had revealed fundamental character flaws that wouldn't improve even if they eventually moved out and found their own place. Their willingness to exploit my grief and generosity, their casual dismissal of my rights and feelings, and their use of my grandchildren as emotional leverage demonstrated a level of selfishness and manipulation that would affect all future family relationships. She helped me see that selling the house wasn't just about protecting myself from further abuse. It was about teaching my son and daughter-in-law that their actions had consequences, that exploiting people's love and vulnerability eventually led to justice, and that taking someone for granted could result in losing them entirely. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was refuse to enable their adult child's irresponsible behavior, even when that refusal caused short-term pain and conflict. The legal paperwork for the sale moved forward smoothly, with Robert Martinez reviewing all documents to ensure my interests were protected and the transaction couldn't be challenged by disgruntled family members. He explained that as the sole property owner, I had absolute authority to sell the house without consulting Brandon and Jessica, or considering their housing needs. They were occupants without any legal rights, and their personal inconvenience wasn't a factor the law would consider relevant to my property decisions. Robert also helped me prepare for the inevitable emotional manipulation and guilt-tripping that would follow my announcement. He warned me that Brandon and Jessica would likely claim I was destroying the family, abandoning my grandchildren, and acting irrationally due to grief or mental incompetence. They would probably threaten to cut off my access to Tyler and Emma, suggest that Walter would be disappointed in my decision, and accuse me of choosing money over family relationships. His advice was to remain focused on the facts rather than responding to emotional manipulation. I owned the house, I had the right to sell it, and their financial problems were not my responsibility to solve. If they wanted to maintain family relationships, they could do so after finding their own housing and learning to treat me with the respect that any family member deserved. The burden of repairing our relationships would be on them, not on me. Meanwhile, Marcus kept me informed about his renovation plans, which became more elaborate and expensive as he finalized his vision for the property. He intended to add a second story, completely remodel the kitchen and bathrooms, install a swimming pool in the backyard, and convert the garage into a guest suite. The scope of the project meant that the current residents would need to vacate immediately upon closing, with no possibility of extended timelines or gradual transitions. Learning about Marcus's renovation plans gave me a secret satisfaction that probably wasn't entirely healthy but felt absolutely justified. Brandon had spent 8 months treating my house like his personal kingdom, making decisions about household management and financial arrangements as if he owned the property. Soon he would watch through the fence as his former domain was demolished and rebuilt according to someone else's vision, someone who had already proven Brandon's incompetence in a court of law. The timing of my announcement was crucial to the success of my plan. I needed to give Brandon and Jessica enough notice to find alternative housing, but not enough time to mount legal challenges or emotional campaigns that might complicate the sale. After consulting with both Robert and Marcus, I decided to reveal my decision exactly 2 weeks before the scheduled closing date, providing them with 14 days to accept reality and make alternative arrangements. I spent considerable time crafting my announcement, wanting to be clear and definitive without being unnecessarily cruel. This was still my son and daughter-in-law, still the parents of grandchildren I loved deeply. But it was also the moment when I would reclaim my dignity and independence after months of being treated like an unwelcome burden in my own home. The message needed to reflect both my love for my family and my refusal to continue accepting their disrespectful treatment. Carol helped me rehearse the conversation, playing the role of Jessica and challenging me with the kinds of arguments and emotional manipulation I could expect. She pushed me to remain calm and factual when faced with accusations, tears, and threats. She reminded me that Brandon and Jessica had created this situation through their own choices, and that protecting myself from further abuse wasn't selfish or cruel. The night before my announcement, I sat in Walter's chair and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 months ago, I had welcomed my son's family into my home with love and hope, believing that providing them with stability and support would strengthen our family bonds and give me the companionship I needed after Walter's death. Instead, their presence had taught me that some people would take advantage of any kindness, and that unconditional love without boundaries was an invitation to abuse. But I had also learned that I was stronger and more resilient than I had given myself credit for. The grief and loneliness that had made me vulnerable to manipulation had also clarified my values and priorities. I had rediscovered my voice, my backbone, and my refusal to accept treatment that would have been unthinkable during the early years of my marriage when Walter and I were building our life together. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end of this chapter in my life. Brandon and Jessica would learn that their comfortable arrangement was ending, that their exploitation of my generosity had finally reached its limit, and that treating someone badly eventually resulted in losing them entirely. The revolution was about to begin, and I was ready to watch their world crumble, just as thoroughly as they had tried to crumble mine. The morning I chose to change everything started like any other Tuesday in our dysfunctional household. Jessica was organizing the children's school supplies in the kitchen, while making pointed comments about how someone had left dishes in the sink overnight. Brandon was drinking coffee and scrolling through his phone, avoiding eye contact with anyone as usual. Tyler was eating cereal and asking questions about his upcoming field trip, while Emma practiced writing her letters at the table with stubborn concentration. I sat among them, sipping my own coffee and watching this domestic scene with the detached observation of someone who had already mentally stepped outside the family dynamic. In 2 hours, Marcus Thompson would arrive to finalize our contract and collect the keys for his final walkthrough. In 14 days, this kitchen would belong to someone else, and Brandon and Jessica would be scrambling to find new housing while facing the reality that their comfortable exploitation of my generosity had finally reached its end. Jessica was discussing her plans for redecorating the living room when I cleared my throat and made the announcement that would shatter their world. I told them calmly that I had sold the house to Marcus Thompson, that the closing was scheduled for 2 weeks from today, and that they would need to find alternative housing immediately. The words came out steady and clear, without emotion or apology, stated as simple facts that required no discussion or negotiation. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the kitchen clock ticking and Emma's pencil scratching against her homework paper. Jessica's face went through a series of expressions, starting with confusion, progressing to disbelief, and finally settling into the kind of rage that makes people say things they can never take back. Brandon's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips, and his mouth fell open as if he couldn't process what he had just heard. Jessica was the first to find her voice, and her response was everything I had expected and prepared for. She accused me of losing my mind, of making decisions I wasn't competent to make, of destroying my own family out of spite and confusion. She demanded to know how I could sell the house without consulting them, how I could displace my own grandchildren, how I could choose a stranger's money over my family's welfare. Her voice rose to the pitch that had terrified Tyler when he broke the vase, but now it had no power to intimidate me. I responded to each accusation with calm facts that I had rehearsed with Carol and Robert Martinez. I owned the house free and clear. I had every legal right to sell my own property, and their housing needs were not my responsibility to provide. I pointed out that they were adults with the same obligation to support their own family that every other parent in America faced. I reminded them that this arrangement was supposed to be temporary, and that 8 months was more than enough time for responsible adults to get back on their feet financially. Brandon's reaction was perhaps more devastating than Jessica's rage, because it revealed the complete absence of any backbone or moral center in my son. He didn't defend me against Jessica's increasingly personal attacks, and he didn't acknowledge that their treatment of me had contributed to this outcome. Instead, he focused entirely on the practical inconvenience my decision would cause for his family, whining about the difficulty of finding affordable housing and the stress of moving with young children. When I mentioned that the buyer was Marcus Thompson, Brandon's face went white with recognition and something approaching terror. He stammered questions about how Marcus had learned about the house, whether I had deliberately chosen him as a buyer, whether this was some kind of revenge for their previous business conflict. The fear in his voice was satisfying in ways that probably weren't entirely healthy, but felt absolutely justified after months of being treated like an unwelcome burden in my own home. Jessica's response to learning Marcus Thompson's identity was swift and vicious. She accused me of selling to Brandon's enemy out of malice and spite, of choosing the one buyer who would cause them maximum humiliation and stress. She claimed that my decision proved I cared more about hurting them than about maintaining family relationships or protecting my grandchildren's emotional welfare. She suggested that Walter would be ashamed of my vindictive behavior and my willingness to destroy our family legacy. The mention of Walter's hypothetical disappointment was the one attack that briefly shook my resolve, but I had prepared for this manipulation with Robert Martinez's help. I told Jessica firmly that Walter would be proud of me for finally standing up to people who had taken advantage of my kindness and generosity. I pointed out that he had spent 50 years building this house as our legacy, not as a free housing solution for adult children who refused to take responsibility for their own lives. Tyler and Emma had stopped eating and were staring at the adults with the wide-eyed confusion of children watching their world collapse without understanding why. I knelt down to their level and explained gently that Grandma was moving to a new house, and that they would be moving to their own house too, where they could decorate their rooms however they wanted and have adventures in a new neighborhood. I promised them that we would still see each other regularly, and that loving families stayed connected even when they didn't live in the same house. The children's innocent questions about why everyone was upset and whether they had done something wrong broke my heart, but they also strengthened my resolve to remove them from the toxic environment their parents had created. Tyler asked if he would still be able to help me in the garden, and Emma wanted to know if she could visit my new house for cookie-making sessions. Their genuine concern for maintaining our relationship contrasted sharply with their parents' focus on their own convenience and comfort. Jessica's final desperate strategy was to threaten cutting off my access to the grandchildren entirely. She declared that if I insisted on this cruel and unnecessary disruption of their lives, she would ensure that I never saw Tyler and Emma again. She claimed that grandmothers who destroyed their family's stability didn't deserve relationships with their grandchildren, and that she wouldn't allow her children to be exposed to someone who made such selfish and destructive decisions. The threat to weaponize my grandchildren was exactly what Robert Martinez had warned me to expect, and I was prepared with a response that Jessica hadn't anticipated. I told her calmly that any attempt to interfere with my relationship with Tyler and Emma would result in legal action for grandparent visitation rights. I explained that California law recognized grandparents' rights to maintain relationships with their grandchildren, especially when those relationships had been significant and ongoing. I also pointed out that courts would be very interested in hearing about parents who used children as weapons against grandparents who had provided them with free housing for 8 months. The mention of legal consequences clearly frightened Jessica, who had assumed that emotional manipulation and guilt would be sufficient to maintain her control over the situation. She had never considered that I might have consulted an attorney or prepared for her threats. The realization that I was legally protected and strategically prepared seemed to deflate some of her rage and replace it with a calculating assessment of her actual options. Brandon's contribution to this family crisis was to suggest that maybe we could work out some kind of compromise that would allow them to stay in the house while I moved elsewhere. He proposed that they could take over the mortgage payments and buy the house from me over time, or that we could establish a formal rental agreement that would give them long-term security while providing me with monthly income. His suggestions revealed a complete failure to understand that the problem wasn't financial logistics but rather their fundamental disrespect for me as a person and property owner. I explained to Brandon that no compromise was possible because the issue wasn't money or housing arrangements. The issue was that they had demonstrated they couldn't treat me with basic respect and consideration while living in my home. They had charged me rent to live in my own house, excluded me from family activities, isolated me from my grandchildren, and threatened to have me institutionalized when I objected to their treatment. No rental agreement or payment plan could address the underlying character problems that had made our living arrangement toxic and unsustainable. Marcus Thompson arrived right on schedule for our final contract meeting, and his presence in the house created an electric tension that was almost palpable. Brandon couldn't bring himself to make eye contact with the man who had once sued him successfully, while Jessica glared at Marcus with open hostility. Marcus maintained perfect professional courtesy, greeting Brandon politely and expressing hope that the transition would go smoothly for everyone involved. During our contract finalization, Marcus mentioned casually that his renovation plans were quite extensive and would require the property to be completely vacant within 48 hours of closing. He explained that his construction crew would be arriving immediately to begin demolition work, and that any remaining personal belongings would need to be removed, or they would be disposed of as construction debris. The message was clear. This wasn't a gradual transition where Brandon and Jessica could take their time finding new arrangements. The 2 weeks that followed were a masterclass in how quickly comfortable situations can disintegrate when they're built on exploitation rather than mutual respect. Brandon and Jessica scrambled to find affordable housing in a rental market that had become increasingly expensive since they had stopped paying attention to it 8 months earlier. Their credit scores had deteriorated during their period of financial irresponsibility, and their employment history was inconsistent enough to concern potential landlords. Jessica's efforts to rally family and friends to pressure me into changing my mind were largely unsuccessful. Most people, when they heard the full story of how they had been treating me, expressed shock that I had tolerated their behavior for as long as I had. Carol proved to be an effective character witness, sharing observations with anyone who would listen about the dramatic changes in my health and happiness since Brandon and Jessica had moved in. Even Walter's sister Linda, who had initially been sympathetic to Jessica's complaints, withdrew her support when she learned about the rent payments and isolation tactics. The children's adjustment to the news was heartbreaking but also revealing. Tyler became increasingly clingy with me as the moving date approached, as if he sensed that the stability he had known in this house was disappearing forever. Emma started having more frequent nightmares and asking questions about whether families always stayed together and why grown-ups sometimes made decisions that hurt children's feelings. Their emotional distress was genuine and painful to witness, but it also demonstrated how much the adult conflict had been affecting them even before my announcement. I spent considerable time during those final weeks helping Tyler and Emma process their feelings and maintain hope for our future relationship. I assured them repeatedly that grandmothers and grandchildren could love each other just as much whether they lived in the same house or different houses. I promised specific activities we would do together and places we would go once everyone was settled in their new homes. Most importantly, I explained that sometimes adults had to make difficult decisions to protect their own health and happiness, and that taking care of yourself wasn't selfish when other people weren't treating you kindly. Brandon made several half-hearted attempts to repair our relationship during those final weeks, but his efforts were too little and too late to change my decision. He apologized for not standing up to Jessica more often, and admitted that some of her demands had been unreasonable. He promised that things would be different if I would reconsider the sale, that they would respect my authority as the homeowner, and treat me with the consideration I deserved. But his apologies felt hollow because they came only after consequences had arrived, not because he had developed genuine remorse for his behavior. I told Brandon that I appreciated his acknowledgement of the problems, but that trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with promises and good intentions. He had shown me his true character by standing silently while his wife charged me rent to live in my own house. He had revealed his priorities by choosing his marriage over his relationship with his mother when those loyalties came into conflict. I would always love him as my son, but I would never again place myself in a position where he could choose to abandon me for his own convenience. The closing day arrived with all the efficiency that Marcus Thompson's cash offer had promised. I signed the papers transferring ownership of the house that had been my home for 45 years, accepted a cashier's check that represented my freedom and independence, and handed over the keys to a man who would erase every trace of the life Walter and I had built within those walls. The transaction took less than an hour, but it marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. Brandon and Jessica had found a small apartment across town that they could barely afford, and they moved out the day before closing, with the bitter efficiency of people who had run out of options. Jessica's final words to me were accusations about destroying my family and ruining my grandchildren's sense of security. Brandon said nothing at all, loading boxes into a rented truck with the defeated posture of someone who had finally learned that actions have consequences. But Tyler and Emma's goodbye was different. They hugged me tightly and made me promise to call them every day and visit them in their new apartment as soon as they were settled. Tyler gave me a drawing he had made of our garden, with carefully labeled flowers, and a note that said he loved me more than all the plants in the world. Emma presented me with a bracelet she had made from colorful beads, explaining that when I wore it I would remember how much she missed me. I moved temporarily into Carol's guest room while I searched for my own new living arrangement, and the change in my emotional and physical health was immediate and dramatic. The constant tension and anxiety that had defined my daily life for 8 months disappeared almost overnight. I slept peacefully for the first time in nearly a year, woke up looking forward to each day, and rediscovered the joy in simple activities that had been overshadowed by household conflict and emotional manipulation. Marcus Thompson's renovation project began immediately and was even more extensive than he had originally described. Within a week, construction crews had demolished the interior walls and begun expanding the foundation for the second-story addition. The house that had once represented 45 years of family memories was being transformed into something completely different, erasing the past and creating space for new stories to unfold. Watching the demolition from Carol's front porch, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and liberation. Each wall that came down represented memories that Walter and I had cherished, but it also represented freedom from the toxic associations that Brandon and Jessica had created. Sometimes destruction was necessary for renewal, and sometimes letting go of what had been was the only way to make room for what could be. 3 months after the sale, I found my own perfect retirement home in a senior community, 20 minutes away from Tyler and Emma's apartment. The house was smaller than what I had been accustomed to, but it was entirely mine, filled with my chosen belongings and organized according to my preferences. I had a garden where I could grow Walter's favorite roses, a kitchen where I could cook without permission or schedule restrictions, and a living room where I could watch television at whatever volume one chose. My relationship with the grandchildren flourished in ways that surprised everyone except me. Without the tension and manipulation that had characterized our household, Tyler and Emma were free to enjoy our visits without feeling caught between competing adult loyalties. I picked them up every Saturday for adventures that ranged from zoo visits to ice cream expeditions to craft projects that covered my dining room table with glitter and construction paper. Our relationship became stronger and more genuine when it was built on mutual affection rather than imposed proximity. Brandon and Jessica's adjustment to financial independence proved as difficult as I had expected. Without free housing to subsidize their lifestyle, they were forced to confront the reality of their spending habits and employment inconsistencies. Brandon's landscaping business remained sporadic and unreliable, while Jessica discovered that the job market was unforgiving for someone who had spent several years avoiding steady employment. Their marriage began showing signs of strain as financial pressure replaced the comfortable arrangement they had exploited for 8 months. But the most satisfying aspect of their situation was watching them learn the lessons that responsible adults should have learned years earlier. They had to budget carefully for groceries, prioritize essential expenses over luxuries, and accept that their children's wants couldn't always be satisfied immediately. They were experiencing the normal challenges of parenthood and adulthood that they had avoided while living in my house, and the education was clearly difficult but necessary. 6 months after selling the house, I received an unexpected phone call from Brandon. His voice was subdued and genuinely remorseful as he apologized for the way they had treated me, and acknowledged that losing the house had been a direct consequence of their own behavior. He admitted that Jessica's demands had been unreasonable, and that he should have defended me instead of enabling her manipulation. Most importantly, he asked if there was any possibility of rebuilding our relationship now that they had learned to appreciate what they had lost. The conversation was emotional and complex, touching on years of disappointment and months of betrayal. I told Brandon that I was willing to work toward repairing our relationship, but that it would require genuine changes in behavior rather than temporary remorse motivated by consequences. He would need to demonstrate consistent respect for my boundaries and decisions. He would need to prioritize our relationship even when it created tension with Jessica. Most importantly, he would need to understand that being my son was a privilege that could be lost if he chose to take it for granted again. Brandon agreed to my conditions, and we began the slow process of rebuilding trust through regular phone calls and supervised visits with the grandchildren. Jessica remained largely absent from these interactions, apparently still too angry and proud to acknowledge her role in destroying our family relationships. But Tyler and Emma thrived under the new arrangement, enjoying quality time with both their father and grandmother without the toxic tension that had previously defined our interactions. A year after selling the house, I drove past the property to see how Marcus Thompson's renovation project had progressed. The transformation was so complete that I barely recognized the place where Walter and I had raised our children and built our life together. The modest 3-bedroom ranch house had become an impressive 2-story contemporary home with modern landscaping and architectural details that reflected current design trends rather than 1970s sensibilities. For a moment, I felt a pang of loss for the memories that had been erased along with the original structure, but then I remembered the toxic environment that Brandon and Jessica had created in those familiar rooms, and I felt grateful that Marcus had given the property a completely fresh start. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for memories was to preserve them in your heart while allowing their physical manifestations to evolve into something new. Today, 3 years after selling the house to Marcus Thompson, I live independently in my retirement community and maintain strong relationships with Tyler and Emma, who are now 9 and 7 years old. They spend alternate weekends with me, call me every evening to share stories about their school days, and consider my house their second home where grandma's rules apply and unlimited cookie consumption is not only allowed but encouraged. Brandon and I have rebuilt a cautious but genuine relationship based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. He has learned to appreciate having a mother who loves him without enabling his irresponsible behavior, while I have learned to love my son without sacrificing my own dignity and well-being. Jessica and I maintain polite distance, speaking cordially when necessary for the children's sake, but acknowledging that some relationships cannot be repaired after trust has been fundamentally violated. The lesson I learned from this experience is that love without respect is worthless, and that family members who exploit your generosity deserve the same consideration they show you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their bad behavior, even when that refusal causes short-term pain and conflict. Sometimes protecting yourself isn't selfish but necessary, and sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who need to learn that love has limits. Walter used to say that home wasn't about the walls and roof over your head, but about the love you put into every corner and room. He was right, but I learned that when people contaminate that love with manipulation and disrespect, sometimes you have to tear down the walls and start over somewhere new. The house on Maple Street may be gone, but the home I've built in my retirement community is filled with the same love, just protected by better boundaries and stronger walls. To anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, being taken advantage of by family members who mistake kindness for weakness, remember that you have more power than you realize. You have the right to be treated with respect in your own home. You have the authority to make decisions about your own property and living arrangements. Most importantly, you have the strength to start over at any age if that's what protecting your dignity requires. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be a victim anymore. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.